Bhagavad-Gītā is considered to be the ABC of spiritual knowledge. Anyone who is interested in understanding what is spirit, what is matter, who is the controller, Bhagavad-Gītā is the entry point for that understanding. And in order to understand Bhagavad-Gītā, we have to approach through those who are practicing Bhagavad-Gītā. Otherwise, Bhagavad-Gītā can appear to be just a piece of information, and there are different varieties of commentators who have tried to give commentaries on Bhagavad-Gītā, but in their own ways, what they have done is that they have presented their own ideas. Because if they are not practicing Bhagavad-Gītā just on the basis of scholarship, if they approach Bhagavad-Gītā, it would be very, very challenging to enter into the spirit of the real understanding. So we are very fortunate here today to have someone who had been practicing for many years, and he is very effective in sharing this knowledge with college audience, with corporate audience, and has been traveling for many, many years and giving this knowledge and uplifting the consciousness of many, many different varieties of people around the world. So without any further ado, let's welcome His Holiness Romapada Swami, and if you pay attention to the message, I'm sure you will all benefit.
I'm told that the topic for the evening, kind of following what you did last week, is Introduction to Bhagavad-Gītā. So, anybody here not familiar with Bhagavad-Gītā? Not familiar? Okay. There's a copy waiting for you over there. It's got your name on it, and he'll make sure you get it.
Yes.
Okay. Bhagavad-Gītā is part of a big epic. Mahabharata is the name. It's the history of Greater India, and it's a description of lineages of kings that existed during a grand period of thousands of years ago. Literally, the book was written 5,000 years ago. And within the middle, literally right in the very middle of that history, is a treatise on elevation of consciousness of the living entity up to the stage of full self-realization. And you can see the scene. It's a battlefield. There's the two armies on both sides. And one of the chief warriors, pictured here, his name is Arjuna. His dear friend, Krishna, is taking the position of the charioteer of Arjuna, and he requests Krishna to draw his chariot between the two armies so he can see who is arrayed. And seeing the whole scene, he decides to not go through with the battle. He's going to walk away from the battlefield and not participate. And he gives his ethical reasons. A big theme of this Mahabharata is the struggle of good and evil. The good guys and the bad guys. Those that stand for virtue and those that stand for anything goes. Any dirty play as long as you win. So it's a struggle of good and evil, and good prevails as much as light prevails over darkness, always. So here, this is not just good over evil, it's transcendence, or the knowledge of the soul, and how the soul can move beyond the limitations of right and wrong, and good and bad, and light and dark, and yin and yang, and duality, the dualities of this material existence. So we're going to, as was done last week, I was told that you had just touched on the 5 main topics of Bhagavad-Gītā. It's not, categories, here's 5 buckets. It's not done like that. There are topics that are woven back and forth within the conversation between Arjuna and Krishna. And these 5 main topics are, as shown here. The Sanskrit term is Ishvara, means the supreme, or God, or the controller, and the living entity, or Jiva in Sanskrit, material nature, time, and fruitive activities. So we're going to be discussing what Bhagavad-Gītā says about these, briefly, so in introduction fashion. And we'll start up here with the living entity, and then material nature, and so forth. So there's a nice little drawing of the first topic. A happy living entity, that's us. And the teaching of Bhagavad-Gītā is that the living entity, or the soul, or ourselves and our true spiritual identity, have these natural characteristics of being eternal, the source of consciousness, and by nature, you can see that smiling person there, blissful. However, the living entity, or the soul, when coming in contact with matter, becomes covered by a subtle body. This is Bhagavad-Gītā's teaching. These subtle features that cover the soul are mind, intelligence, and false ego, progressively subtle, more subtle, and most subtle. And then there's another covering, a gross body, that covers the subtle body and the soul. And there's these 5 elements: earth, water, fire, air, and ether, or space. So it's something like a jewel inside an envelope, and that envelope is inside another envelope, or covering. And this is who we are. However, when the coverings, subtle body, gross body, are covering the soul, we forget who we are, and we identify with the feelings in our mind, or the intelligent thoughts that we have, or the body that's covering the subtle body, when in fact our real identity is a soul. So here's an artist's rendering of something that helps get a picture of the soul. This is a painting of a patient who is undergoing heart surgery. There's a number of books. Dr. Michael Sabum from Emory University is one author who is a heart surgeon by profession and also professor at Emory. And while performing open heart surgery of a patient, the patient had the experience of cardiac arrest. Cardiac arrest means the heart stops. When the heart stops, blood doesn't go to the brain. And when that happens, there's a procedure. They see these little gadgets, they say, the heart has stopped, so they pull out some electrodes and place the electrodes on the chest to stimulate the heart to beat artificially, so that maybe kind of like jump-starting a car, it'll start up again on its own. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So this particular patient survived, and the next day or two, when Dr. Sabum went to see his patient, he asked his patient, how are you? And the patient said, I'm fine. And the patient started describing what happened during cardiac arrest. And he described that he was floating up above the operation table, looking down upon his body, and the assistant said to the doctor, that said to the nurse, different things, and the procedures, and details and details and details. Observing from above the operating table his own body lying on the operating table, and in details that were accurate. And Dr. Sabum thought, gee, this is ridiculous. It's not possible. Because from a medical point of view, consciousness is electrochemical events that take place in the neurological system, and the synapses are within the brain. That's what consciousness is. And so when blood stops going into the brain, consciousness stops, because electrochemical events stop. So the electrochemical events, they had stopped, but here was the conscious person, separate from the body and separate from the brain, observing the body. So that's a no-no for medical science. So he decided, I want to find out what's the explanation behind this. And 12 years later he published a book, because he found out there were other heart surgeons and then he himself had other patients who reported what's called out-of-body experiences. They have an acronym, OBE, out-of-body experience. So the point is, keep it simple, can keep within our time, the seat of consciousness is not the body. Seat of consciousness is something else, and after 12 years, Michael Sabum wrote, I hate to say this, I mean, medical doctors aren't supposed to say this, but evidence points to the conscious self is something other than the body, which is what Krishna says in Bhagavad-Gītā. Who we are is not the body. That's chapter 2, Bhagavad-Gītā. And in chapter 2, Krishna gives qualities of the soul that indicate its non-physical aspect. For example, the soul can't be cut to pieces, so it's not earth. Can't be burned by fire, it's not made of fire. Can't be moistened by water, can't be withered by the wind, it's not material. The individual soul is unbreakable and insoluble and eternally the same. The soul is invisible, inconceivable, and immutable. So this is some information found in chapter 2 Bhagavad-Gītā about the qualities of the soul. And so the soul, the conscious self, this is transmigration, or after leaving the soul, passing through the different stages of life. After this life, it passes on to another body and continues in rotation. That's reincarnation is a concept discussed in Bhagavad-Gītā. And so the covering of the soul, the gross and subtle coverings, that's this material nature. So we're now on topic number 2 of 5. So Sanskrit word is prakriti, and the meaning is material nature. And according to Bhagavad-Gītā, actually there are more verses in Bhagavad-Gītā discussing this topic than any other topic, because it's a little complicated. There are 3 modes of nature. That's these 3 ladies that are like puppeteers: yellow, red, and blue. Like, the primary colors. And you mix the primary colors and you can make any color. Similarly, there's 3 modes of nature, and you mix the 3 modes of nature, you get all varieties within material nature. Varieties of people, varieties of mentalities, varieties of species, varieties of cultures, varieties of everything, based upon these 3 modes. And there's, of course, lots of detail. Then down here, that's us thinking, I'm the supervisor and I'm the laborer, when in fact we're all being operated under the direction of these modes of nature. And then there's one who is supervising those modes of nature. This is an artist's rendering of those same material elements. You remember those earth, water, fire, air, and ether. And then there's the subtle elements, mind, intelligence, false ego. They're being carried, the soul, that's this one, this spark, is being carried by the material elements through space. And side by side with the soul, there's this other supreme soul. We're going to mention that a little bit later. It's just an artist's rendering, graphically depicting what bodies are made of, and the conscious self is something distinct. Oops. Another verse from Bhagavad-Gītā is teaching that the senses, so sight, smell, sound, touch, and taste, the five senses, they're like horses and they're pulling the chariot, the body made of two wheels, that's karma. And then there's the steering mechanism for the horses, that's the mind. And over here, that's the intelligence that's giving direction to the mind, who's giving direction to the horses. And there's this terrified passenger inside. That's a living entity going for a ride on the chariot of the senses, the mind, the intelligence, and then the two wheels of karma. We're going to touch on karma in a moment too. That's one of the five topics. Out of the different species of life that the soul transmigrates or moves into, especially rare and significant is the human form of life. This is a verse from Bhagavad-Gītā that's teaching this point, that the human form of life, which is, although rare and temporary, it gives the opportunity for achieving the fullness of consciousness. Okay, so far we've touched on, lightly, two topics of five. The living entity, the conscious self, the covering, gross and subtle, made of material nature, and how they mix. Then here comes the third topic, and you're familiar with the term karma. Anyone not familiar with the term karma? You're all familiar. Somewhat. Well, it's a little artist illustration, the cause and effect. It's like dominoes, or if you push this one, it falls down, it knocks over that one. That one knocks down, you falls over on that one, and so forth. And then guess what happens when it comes around here? It's going to fall on the guy's head. Although he's just pressing over here. Something over here is going to happen. There's a little, I hope nobody's offended by British humor. There's a little video clip made by some British folks that they want to explain karma. This causes that, causes that, causes that, causes that, causes that, and it comes back. You ready? It's a different kind of humor. Anyway, here we go. Look out, here comes a truck. British humor. This causes that, causes that, causes that, causes that, and it comes back. So it's similar, the law of karma is not the same, but similar to Newton's third law. That says for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. So that means when you do actions that are acts of kindness to others, that kindness comes back to you. When you do an act that causes pain and suffering to other living entities, that pain and suffering comes back to you. And you can't neutralize it. Supposing you did something bad. Accidentally you do something bad. It's going to come, the reaction is going to come. And it may not, here's a description of how, it's not necessarily immediately. Maybe it's before your time, but when the Beatles had a song called Instant Karma. Familiar with that one? Instant karma. So there's some karma that boom, boom, action, reaction. But sometimes it's delayed. And the delay is described sometimes by comparing the seeds that are sitting there in an apple. The potential of another apple tree is within each seed. So that's like this term here, bija, or in seed. And then some are being fully manifested. They're like falling from the tree, ripe. That's this one, prarabdha karma. And some are not yet manifested. So these are Sanskrit terms, not directly within Bhagavad-Gītā, but it's some details of, there's different types of karma. Some that are not yet manifested, some that are presently manifested, some that are in a seed form, and this other term, kuta, is just like a propensity, a general proclivity towards work in a particular type, like good or bad work. And here's a timeline, just to give an idea, where sometimes the smaller circles are, there's fructification of something good or bad that comes back quickly. Sometimes it's a bigger cycle of time, sometimes it's a really big cycle of time, sometimes it's an even bigger cycle of time. So it's not like something that happened one moment ago is necessarily going to fructify today, or what's happening this moment could be from several lifetimes previously. So these red lines indicate, a lifetime. So someone takes birth in this lifetime, and they're doing things. So during that lifetime, they're generating new karma. Again, some may fructify quickly, some at a later period of time, like that. So that's when some misfortune comes our way, we may wonder, gee, where did that misfortune come from? And it may not necessarily even be in this life, of some bad deed brings a bad fortune. Now, that's 3 topics already. 2 more to go. There's someone that's supervising or overseeing this, the actions that we do, and the living entity's desires for finding happiness and so on. So that's Ishvara, or the Supreme Absolute Truth. So here's a definition of what the Supreme Absolute Truth is. That which is the source of everything. That's a simple definition. That from which everything comes. Those of you from India, you probably know this phrase from Vedanta Sutra. Janmad yasya yataha is the first aphorism or phrase from Vedanta Sutra that says, the absolute truth is that from which everything comes, the cause of all other causes that bring about effects that later may become the cause of the next effect, and so on. The original cause, that whatever that is, that's the absolute truth. And because the absolute truth is the cause or source, therefore the absolute truth is the proprietor. And because the absolute truth is the proprietor, it's the absolute truth, or the supreme person, is the supreme enjoyer. And that same supreme enjoyer is overseeing material nature. And material nature is awarding the good and the bad and so forth that happens to us. But we're making choices, and based on our choices, we're determining our own destiny, or we're building our own karma. And going quickly here because it's just a summary, each of these topics are explored in depth within Bhagavad-Gītā. There's a nice meaning for those of you that have some idea of Eastern philosophy or Eastern wisdom. Within that supreme, there's fullness of opulence. Like, for example, in this world, there are some people that are very wealthy. Think of some names of some people that are very wealthy. What's the fellow that... Bill Gates. Warren Buffett. There's some people in China that are really mega wealthy too. So, and some people in India. And so, somewhere there's somebody really wealthy, and then somewhere there's somebody more wealthy, and somebody more wealthy, and somebody more wealthy. But no one can claim they have all wealth, but that which is, or he who is the possessor of all wealth, that's the Supreme. And someone is famous, Michael Jackson, or some, movie star, or some, politician, and something, something, something. But, someone more famous, and everyone knows God, so he's the possessor of all fame. But this is a definition from the Vedic literature. Someone in this world, people revere knowledge, and somewhere there's somebody that has more knowledge and more knowledge and more knowledge, and the possessor of all knowledge in full, that's Ishvara, or the Supreme. So that Ishvara is situated, as the illustration showed, within the heart. Along with the living entity, there's a witness. And I wanted to have this diagram, but I don't have it, so I'll just say it. There's a statement not within Bhagavad-Gītā, but within similar literature, a metaphor, that it's like having two birds in a tree, and one bird is jumping from branch to branch, enjoying the fruits on the tree. Another bird is not, but just observing the jumping bird. And the jumping one is us, trying to be the enjoyer of the fruits of our activities. And the other bird, Ishvara, the Supreme Conscious Being, situated within each of our bodies, the same one within all of us, is the witness. He's the knower, he's observing, and according to the type of activity that we perform, there's some karma that accrues to us for those activities. And this is a painting of, so the Supreme Person, according to the message of Bhagavad-Gītā, is situated in the vastness of the spiritual sky, within which there's a cloud, and an expansion of him is there to oversee all these little orbs, are universes. According to the Vedic picture, there's not just this one universe, there's unlimited numbers of universes, and living entities are occupying bodies within the planets, within each of these universes, and there's the Supreme. So that's one of the 5 topics of Bhagavad-Gītā. And then the last of the 5 is something that's very fascinating, and that's time. Time is an energy, a spiritual force that both brings things into being and maintains things for some time, and then time also destroys everything. It's invisible. Right? You can look at your watch and say, there's tick, 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 and that's time. It's a measurement of time, but the force of time is something else. It's an energy that's from the Supreme, and it brings creation about. It makes things happen, just like, here we are. We're sitting in the sacred space. And somewhere before, we were somewhere else. And when we're done, we're going to go somewhere else. So we require time for activity on this plane. And so time is a topic, one of the 5 essential topics, because without time, you don't have anything. You don't have any material anything. You don't have activity. You don't have birth. You don't have aging. You don't have school. You don't have exams. Yay. You don't have anything. Time is required. And so time is under Krishna's direction, and how that time works to help move things around is one of the topics in Bhagavad-Gītā. So that's a very quick summary. Again, here's the picture of Krishna. After Arjuna hears the message of Bhagavad-Gītā, he's ready to follow the direction that Krishna gives. And so then that part of Bhagavad-Gītā is over, and then this history thing resumes. So it's in the middle, literally right in the middle of this large good versus evil struggle, there's this message of transcendence, essentially how the living entity, the conscious self, can become separated from identification through false ego, identification with what we're not, and understand what we are, what our relationship with the Supreme is, and to be situated in loving service with the Supreme. And each of those stages, there are types of yoga connected to them. It's like one of the things I assume that takes place here in the sacred space is yoga practice. Any of you perform yoga? Do yoga practice? You do a little?
Not regularly, but yeah, once in a while.
Okay. So commonly, when there's a yoga class, it's asanas, it's sitting postures, and sometimes pranayama, breathing exercise. And those two, the asanas and the breathing exercises, it's two parts of one chapter of Bhagavad-Gītā. Chapter 6 of Bhagavad-Gītā is called Dhyan Yoga. And Dhyan is another one of the eightfold yoga system, Ashtanga Yoga. So all of those, in short, because it's hard to do a summary without spending a lot of time going into detail. In short, the whole of the yoga system, the different stages of elevation of consciousness, have a particular type of yoga assigned or ascribed, and there's a purpose behind them all, or an ultimate intention for all the different yoga systems, and that's very simply restoring the fullness of consciousness of the living entity. The human form of life is very special because in the human form of life, according to Bhagavad-Gītā, and that verse that I showed you before, there's the opportunity, if properly guided, that the fullness of consciousness is something we can experience. And if we don't take that opportunity, then we're awarded another body, and in the cycle of birth and death, depending upon karma, the topic spoken of before, and the modes of nature spoken of before in these topics of Bhagavad-Gītā. And then we take another body accordingly. What Bhagavad-Gītā is advocating is go beyond that cycle of birth and death and become situated in our original state of pure consciousness. Last little point, a very important point, the destination of the soul after having attained pure consciousness. We had a lively discussion at MIT on Monday on the different conceptions of the destination of the soul, because there's somebody that was familiar with Buddhism and some other people familiar with some other teachings, and then there's the teaching of Bhagavad-Gītā, what Krishna says. So they're in that liberated state where the soul is no longer misidentifying with the coverings of the soul. When the soul is self-realized, there are different categories of self-realization, and different, according to those categories, different destinations. So that's discussed briefly in Bhagavad-Gītā also, and more elaborately in other parts of the Vedic literature. But like Partha said, Bhagavad-Gītā is like the ABC. First, before we figure out what's the destination going to be, we need to go do our ABCs and understand who we really are, as opposed to the covering that we otherwise think we are. The body and the mind and the material intelligence and our dear friend, the false ego. and how to extricate the soul from that implication through the systems of yoga described in Bhagavad-Gītā. So there's a little summary, introduction. I don't know what you're going to be doing during the semester, but you're going to cover those topics a little bit?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So any questions or discussion on this? Yes?
Is the Supreme and Krishna separate? Or are these-
It's different terminology depending upon how one views Krishna. Like you, I could say, "Hey, you," you know, while still calling you, but I don't know your name. But then you have a name, so we can address the Supreme as the Supreme, but the Supreme has a name. The Supreme in the ultimate conception or ultimate position is a person. Let me do this. It may help. According to the Vedic literature, this is in that state of pure consciousness. There are different realizations of that pure consciousness. One is impersonal. One is localized. The yogis realize and actively seek contemplating the form of the Supreme within their heart. And then there are those that understand that Supreme is in the heart, ultimately is a Supreme Person. And the Supreme Person is a person who we have a relationship with and can engage in spiritual activity with, in a spiritual form, not the physical one, but a spiritual form, in a Supreme Person, loving person. So Krishna is the name of the person, in his position, or post, Supreme. Like the head of a government, like when newspaper reporters get together, they say, "Mr. President," and you know, the president's children call him Dad, and his wife calls him what she calls him, maybe some nickname, Honey or something. But you know, so it's the same person, but different relationships, then different nomenclature. So the Supreme indicates the post or the position. Yeah.
What are the characteristics of the soul, and if every soul is the same?
Great question. Some of the characteristics I indicated, straight from the Bhagavad-Gītā. Aside from saying it's not matter, like it can't be moistened by water, or withered by the wind, or cut by any weapon, or it's not material. So not material means what? Well, it's spiritual. So spiritual means what? Fully conscious, like, you know, the chair is not fully conscious. The body appears to be conscious because of the presence of the soul. But when the soul leaves, consciousness leaves. It's just inert matter that disintegrates. So the soul has an integrating capacity, bringing matter together to make bodies. That which integrates it is the soul. So you're looking for characteristics. It's eternal. Bodies come into being and go out of being. The soul doesn't. It's eternal. And fully conscious. But it can be covered, like a flame can be covered. But the flame is giving off light. You put the flame inside a pot, and you don't see the flame. Because of the covering. So similarly, the soul is fully conscious, characteristic-wise, but now covered. So then bliss, ananda is the Sanskrit term, by nature, the soul is joyful. But not like happy and sad kind of happy, but blissful, transcendentally situated in, by nature, is blissful. And
The second question is like, every person has a soul.
yes,
in
we have a soul, we are a soul.
Or we are a soul. So is that soul like the same for everyone?
No, individual.
Individual soul.
Just like a snowflake. You're in Boston, so you find snowflakes here. Each snowflake is different. Although they're made of crystal, water crystal, but they're different. Like that, each soul is different. Specifically, in the spiritual conception, we have a unique loving relationship with Krishna. We're alike in the sense that, there's consciousness, and there's eternality, and there's bliss. So those qualities are there, but personality is unique, and spiritual form is unique. So let's do this. Inside, if I put my hand inside a glove and wiggle my fingers, the glove moves. When I remove the glove from my hand, the glove doesn't move anymore, but the finger moves. So similarly, there's a spiritual identity and personality that through matter is causing matter to move. As long as my consciousness is identifying with matter, I continue to get more bodies and more bodies and more bodies according to the contaminated consciousness that I have. But when consciousness becomes relieved of contamination, pure, then there's spiritual form. And in spiritual form, I enjoy spiritual activities in the spiritual realm. That's what souls do, and there's detailed descriptions of that. Not found in Bhagavad-Gītā, but in other literatures, because this is like, 101. Yeah. Anything else? These are good questions.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is the soul eternally bound to matter, or can it escape at some point?
Well, the first part I heard, we're not eternally bound. What was the option?
Is it eternally bound to matter forever, or can it escape at some point?
It can escape. In fact, the advocacy of Bhagavad-Gītā is don't continue in that bondage. Each of the different systems of yoga are for linking with the Supreme, or linking with transcendence. And when the soul becomes linked with transcendence, and that way become pure. When we come in contact with the Supreme Pure, we become pure. And when that pure condition of the soul exists, depending upon the particular type of consciousness that we have, will attain an eternal destination and no more birth and death. The cycle of birth and death is terminated that way. That's Bhagavad-Gīta's message. That's our message for the evening. And there's different systems of yoga, as I mentioned, according to propensities. Some like meditation. So there's a meditation process that's, again, Dhyan Yoga, chapter 6. Some like working. And so there's a chapter in Bhagavad-Gītā, Karma Yoga, linking with the Supreme by offering the results of your work to the Supreme. There's persons that are inclined to understand things through knowledge. So there's a system of yoga called Gyan Yoga, knowledge, the yoga of knowledge, and so forth. And there's subsets of those, like the Hatha Yoga and Pranayama. Some people, anyway. So each of those systems assist in the connection with the Supreme. It's compared. There's like rungs on a ladder. The purpose of a ladder is you're here, you want to get up there. So rungs on a ladder the yoga systems are progressive. And they take one to the top rung. That's described in Bhagavad-Gītā. The top rung is the yoga of devotion. Maybe when you go further, you can discuss that one. And then Krishna commits to Arjuna, I'm going to describe to you in detail how that yoga and devotion can be performed, so that your mind can be completely fixed on the Supreme and all your activities offered with love to the Supreme. I'm going to explain how you can do that. The how-to part. First is like what, and then the how. And so there's elements in that system of yoga, or bhakti yoga specifically. It's a science. It's fascinating, and it's effective. And since there's no other questions, the sound vibration is the essential element that brings consciousness to that higher state, gradual elevation. Just a little sharing. One of the universities that I visited like 10 days ago was Washington University in St. Louis. And the program was on a Friday night, and on Saturday there was just some students that had attended the program that wanted some further discussion. So I sat with some of them, and one of them was a girl, freshman, from Midwest somewhere, and her mother was involved in Christian Science. Heard of that? Christian Science reading rooms is like very popular. Oh.
Yeah, it's like by the big reflecting hole. It's like a church of Christian Science.
Okay. So we had a really fantastic discussion for almost 2 hours, just comparing notes, because she grew up with that. I grew up in a Christian tradition, but I'm most familiar with Bhagavad-Gītā. So what does Christian Science say about things, and what does Bhagavad-Gītā say about things? So there's a lot of similarity, and there's some differences. The similarity includes, she was describing this, that she said, this is my understanding, I may not have the last word on what Christian Science says, but the physical body is not who we are, same as this message, but it's awarded by material nature to allow us to expand and develop consciousness. Which is fantastic, same idea. And if you don't complete that expanding of consciousness opportunity, you get another opportunity, get another lifetime, and you continue and continue. And same conception, one can go down. One doesn't necessarily continue in the human form of life because you got one. You can go down. So reincarnation, upward towards a heavenly destination, downward towards the bad place destination, lower life forms. So then came the question, what happens, I asked, what happens when you attain that state where consciousness is full? Because that's the purpose. Then what happens? And it wasn't really clear. So I said, well, just like I go to the next form of life and get another opportunity to develop consciousness, so I get a form. So, and I'm living somewhere, I'm doing things, I have senses and objects of the senses. So what's that place? Because I told her when I was little, growing up in a Christian family, I asked my mother and father, what's it like? When we hear about heaven, what's it like? What do people do there? And she laughed and said, oh, isn't that nice? Let's go ask the priest. So we went and asked the priest. And the priest said the same thing. Oh, it's such a nice question. And I never got an answer. So I was asking her, was there a picture? But she was saying, well, it's not exactly a place. It's not like, if you go from here to like Zoom and you go there. It's not exactly like that. I said, well, what is it if it's not exactly like that? Well, it's not. It was definition by negation. It's not one of these. It's something else. So I shared with her that the Vedic picture of where you go after that is what I've shared with you this evening. It depends on the shelter or the conception of the Supreme. It can be one of these three, an impersonal or localized or a personal conception. And depending, you'll go to, the soul enters into that atmosphere or that abode or that realm that facilitates that consciousness. And then if you attain that the spiritual conception of this loving relationships with the Supreme Person, that understanding can be transmitted by spiritual sound. Just like this mantra that we were singing before. That's spiritual sound. Though, you don't know the words, the spiritual sound conveys what I was sharing with her, the fullness of that experience. Or, the place, the varieties of loving dealings, and everything is there, like, packed in. And then you can unpack it. But through sound vibration. So, that method is the method that Bhakti is deploying. Sound vibration. And sound vibration can be recorded, not like in an MP3 player, exactly, but it can be recorded like the discussion between Krishna and Arjuna. So hearing that discussion between Krishna and Arjuna is giving, through sound vibration, the picture of the spiritual realm. And through the mantra that we're singing, it doesn't give like all of those details pulled out, but it's there packed in through sound. So one can be brought in contact with transcendence through sound. That's the method. And one has to be careful what sounds you hear too. But then it's possible. So, we're at 9 o'clock. So.
So, let's all thank the speaker. This is Romapada Swami.